I've been teaching for 8 years now, but what happened to me in Millbrook Creek still makes me question everything I thought I knew about small-town communities. I moved there in August 2021, thinking I'd found the perfect place to start fresh after my divorce. The town seemed like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting tree-lined streets, a main drag with family-owned shops, and a school district that actually cared about education. What I discovered about the people there changed my entire perspective on trust and safety. My name is Sarah, and I'd accepted a position teaching 4th grade at Millbrook Creek Elementary. The salary was decent, the cost of living was low, and after the chaos of my marriage falling apart in Sacramento, the idea of a quiet mountain town felt like exactly what I needed. I found a small rental house on Cedar Lane, a cozy 2-bedroom with a white picket fence and a garden that the previous tenant had maintained beautifully. The landlord, Mrs. Patterson, seemed sweet enough, though she asked an unusual number of questions about my family, my background, and why I was moving to their town. The first few weeks went smoothly. My students were well behaved, the parents seemed supportive, and my fellow teachers were friendly enough. I drove my 2018 Honda Civic to work each morning, usually arriving around 7:30 a.m. and staying until 4 p.m. for lesson planning and grading. The routine felt comfortable, normal even. But then the small things started. It began with items being slightly out of place when I came home. Nothing dramatic, just little things that made me pause. The coffee mug I'd left on the counter would be in the sink. The throw pillow on my couch would be positioned differently. The first few times, I convinced myself I was imagining things or simply didn't remember how I'd left things. Moving stress, I told myself. New environment, new routines. Then I noticed the back door mat was askew one afternoon in late September. It was a small detail, but I'm particular about things like that. I always positioned it perfectly straight when I locked up in the morning. That evening, I mentioned it casually to my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, while we were both getting our mail. "Oh, you probably just forgot," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Moving can be so disorienting. Are you settling in well? Making friends?" There was something in her tone that felt more like an interview than neighborly concern. I gave her a polite response and went inside, but something nagged at me. The next morning, I did something I'd never done before. I took a photo of my living room before leaving for work. Nothing obvious, just a casual shot that happened to capture the position of items on my coffee table, the way I'd arranged the couch pillows, the angle of the lamp. If I was losing my mind, at least I'd have proof. When I came home that afternoon, everything was exactly as I'd left it. I felt foolish for being so paranoid. But 2 days later, it happened again. This time, I was certain. The kitchen chair was pulled out from the table. The bathroom towel was folded differently. And most disturbing of all, the spare key I kept in a small magnetic box under the back porch railing was positioned differently than I'd left it. I called a locksmith that evening and had the locks changed. It cost me $200 I couldn't really afford, but the peace of mind seemed worth it. I also bought a small security camera system, nothing fancy, just a basic setup that would send alerts to my phone if motion was detected inside the house. For a week, everything was quiet. I started to relax, thinking maybe I'd solved the problem. Whoever had been using my spare key was now locked out. Then on a Friday in early October, I received a motion alert on my phone at 2:17 p.m. I was in the middle of teaching a math lesson when my phone buzzed. The notification showed movement in my living room, a figure in dark clothing moving calmly through my house like they belonged there. My hands were shaking as I tried to continue the lesson. I couldn't leave my students, but watching someone move through my private space in real time was terrifying. The figure seemed to know exactly where the camera was located and kept their face turned away from it. They moved with purpose, not like someone searching for valuables, but like someone conducting a careful inspection. The intrusion lasted exactly 7 minutes. Then the figure left through the back door, and my house was empty again. I reported it to the police immediately after school. Deputy Martinez took my statement and reviewed the camera footage, but the image quality wasn't clear enough to identify the person. The deputy seemed concerned but also somewhat dismissive. Small towns like this, sometimes people get their wires crossed about property lines or maintenance responsibilities, he said. Could be a misunderstanding. But we'll keep an eye on your place. That weekend, I installed additional cameras and motion sensors. I also started varying my schedule randomly, sometimes staying late at school, sometimes leaving early for appointments. If someone was watching my routine, I wanted to make it unpredictable. The next intrusion happened on a Tuesday. This time, I was ready. I'd left school early, claiming I had a doctor's appointment, and was actually parked down the street in my Civic with a clear view of my house. At 2:45 p.m., I watched as someone approached my back door. They moved confidently, not like someone breaking in, but like someone who had legitimate access. I called 911 and drove closer, staying far enough away to remain hidden but close enough to see. The person was older, wearing a baseball cap and work clothes. They had a key to my back door. The police arrived within minutes, but by then, the person was gone. When we searched my house, nothing was missing, but there were muddy footprints on my kitchen floor and the distinct smell of cigarette smoke in my living room. I don't smoke, and I never allow smoking in my house. Deputy Martinez found something that made his expression change completely. Hidden behind my refrigerator was a small recording device, a tiny digital recorder that had been documenting everything that happened in my kitchen and living room. This changes things, he said grimly. This is criminal surveillance. We need to take this seriously. But when I asked about pressing charges or increasing patrols, Deputy Martinez looked uncomfortable. The thing is, Miss Collins, we need to be careful about how we handle this. Small towns like Millbrook Creek, they have their own ways of dealing with problems. Sometimes it's better to work things out quietly rather than making a big fuss that could complicate things for you. The way he said it made my blood run cold. It sounded less like police advice and more like a warning. That night I couldn't sleep. Every sound made me jump. I deadbolted both doors, secured all the windows, and had my phone ready to call 911 at the first sign of trouble. But no one came. Instead, I found something else the next morning. Slipped under my front door was a handwritten note. Some places aren't meant for everyone. Smart people know when to move on. Friends are just trying to help you make the right choice. I took the note straight to the police station, but Deputy Martinez wasn't on duty. The desk sergeant, a heavy-set man named Officer Thompson, looked at the note and shrugged. Looks like someone's giving you friendly advice, he said. Maybe you should consider it. Teaching jobs are hard to come by, but they're not impossible to find elsewhere. The casual dismissal was almost worse than the threatening note itself. It was becoming clear that whatever was happening to me wasn't just the work of one disturbed individual, it was something the local authorities were unwilling or unable to address properly. That afternoon, I started making phone calls. I reached out to the state police, the county sheriff's office, and even the FBI tip line. I documented everything: the photos, the video footage, the note, the recording device. I wasn't going to let this escalate without creating a paper trail. But what I discovered during those calls was even more disturbing. When I mentioned Millbrook Creek specifically, there was a pattern in the responses. Hesitation. Uncomfortable pauses. Suggestions that I should work with local authorities, or consider whether this situation might resolve itself naturally. It was like the town had some kind of protective shield around it, some unspoken agreement that outsiders shouldn't dig too deep into what happened there. By November, I was barely sleeping. The intrusions had stopped, but that almost made it worse. The waiting, the uncertainty, the feeling of being watched constantly was wearing me down. My teaching was suffering. My students were asking if I was okay. Other teachers were starting to avoid me, like whatever was happening to me might be contagious. And then I found out I wasn't the first. During lunch one day, I overheard two teachers talking quietly in the faculty lounge. They mentioned a previous teacher, someone who'd left suddenly the year before. When I asked about it, they became evasive, but eventually I learned that the teacher, a young man named David, had experienced similar problems. Intrusions, surveillance, pressure to leave town. He was smart. one of them said. He didn't fight it. He just found another position and moved on. Sometimes that's the best thing to do. The way she said it made it clear this wasn't just friendly advice, it was a warning. That weekend, I drove to the next town over and did something I'd never thought I'd need to do. I consulted with a private investigator, a former state police detective named Robert Chin who specialized in small-town corruption cases. When I told him about Millbrook Creek, his expression grew serious. "You're not the first person to contact me about that place," he said. "There's a pattern there. Newcomers, especially professionals who might stay long-term, face systematic harassment until they leave. The local authorities are either complicit or too intimidated to act." He explained that some small towns have what he called informal power structures, groups of long-time residents who see outsiders as threats to their control and influence. They use subtle intimidation, property violations, and social pressure to drive away anyone who might challenge the status quo. "The problem is proving it," Chin continued. "These people are careful. They don't leave evidence. And they often have relationships with local law enforcement that go back generations." But Chin also gave me hope. He told me about other cases where documentation and persistence had eventually led to successful prosecutions. He agreed to take my case, and we began building a comprehensive file of evidence. What I didn't know at the time was that my conversation with Chin had been noticed. Small towns have long memories and extensive networks. By the time I drove back to Millbrook Creek that evening, word had already spread about my meeting with the private investigator. The next morning, I found my car windows had been smashed. All 4 windows of my Honda Civic were spiderwebbed with cracks, and my tires had been slashed. The damage was extensive enough that the car was undrivable. But the most chilling part was what I found on my windshield. Another note, this one more direct than the first. "Last warning. Some people never learn. Don't make this harder on yourself than it needs to be." I called the police, but Officer Thompson's response was predictable. "Probably just kids. Vandalism happens. Maybe you should consider whether staying here is worth all this trouble." That's when I realized I was completely on my own. The investigation Chen and I had started was revealing disturbing patterns. Property records showed that several houses in town had been sold well below market value by previous newcomers who'd left suddenly. Employment records showed a pattern of non-local teachers, social workers, and other professionals leaving their positions unexpectedly. And most disturbing of all, there were whispered stories about people who tried to fight back against the harassment and had faced escalating retaliation. But something else was happening too. My story was connecting to others. Chin had put me in touch with David, the teacher who'd left the year before, and with a social worker named Jennifer who'd experienced similar treatment 2 years earlier. We were building a case that went beyond individual harassment. This was organized, systematic, and had been going on for years. The question was whether we could prove it before something worse happened to me. As I sat in my damaged car that morning, waiting for the tow truck, I realized that what had started as a simple case of someone entering my house had revealed something much darker about Millbrook Creek. This wasn't just about me anymore, it was about a pattern of abuse that had been allowed to continue because outsiders were too intimidated to fight back and insiders were too invested in maintaining the status quo. But I also realized something else. The people doing this had made a mistake. They'd assumed I was like the others, that I'd be scared into leaving quietly. What they didn't understand was that trying to drive me out had only made me more determined to stay and fight. The question now was whether I was strong enough to see this through, and whether the evidence we were gathering would be enough to finally bring justice to Millbrook Creek. Think about your own experiences with small towns or tight-knit communities. Have you ever felt like an outsider who wasn't welcome? What would you do if you discovered your neighbors were systematically trying to drive you away? I've been in construction for 23 years, and I thought I'd seen everything from foundation problems to illegal additions to property line disputes that turned neighbors into enemies. But what I discovered while working in Millbrook Creek last spring changed everything I thought I knew about that town. My name is Marcus Rodriguez, and I'm a licensed general contractor who specializes in foundation repair and basement renovations. What I found beneath those houses still keeps me up at night. It started as a routine job in March 2022. I'd been hired by a property management company to assess foundation issues in several rental properties along Cedar Lane and Maple Avenue. The houses were built in the 1940s and 50s, solid construction for their era, but showing signs of settling and moisture problems that needed professional attention. The pay was good, and I welcomed the work after a slow winter season. I was driving my 2020 Ford F-250 loaded with diagnostic equipment when I first arrived in Millbrook Creek. The town seemed quiet, almost sleepy, but there was something about the way people watched me that felt different from other small communities I'd worked in. When I stopped at Henderson's Hardware to pick up some supplies, the owner, an elderly man named Bill Henderson, asked more questions about my work than seemed normal. "Foundation problems, you said? Which houses exactly?" he asked, leaning across the counter with what looked like genuine concern. "Some of those old places have unique features. You might want to check with the town office before you start digging around." At the time, I figured he was just being cautious about permits and regulations. Small towns can be particular about paperwork, and I appreciated the heads up. But looking back, I realized he was trying to warn me about something much more specific. My first job was a house on Cedar Lane, a small 2-bedroom rental that had been experiencing water intrusion in the basement. The current tenant, a young woman who seemed nervous and jumpy, let me in and immediately disappeared upstairs while I worked. The basement was partially finished, with concrete walls and a drop ceiling that had seen better days. I was setting up my moisture detection equipment when I noticed something odd about the east foundation wall. The concrete looked newer in one section, like it had been patched or repoured sometime after the original construction. When I tapped it with my hammer, it sounded hollow, not solid like the rest of the foundation. Using my thermal imaging camera, I could see a clear temperature differential that suggested there was empty space behind that section of wall. At first, I assumed it was just a construction quirk, maybe an old coal chute that had been sealed up, or a utility access that was no longer needed. But when I started removing some of the newer concrete to assess the moisture problem, I discovered something that made no sense. Behind the patched section was a doorway, not a utility access, but an actual doorway with a steel frame and heavy-duty hinges. The door itself had been removed, but the opening led to a tunnel that extended beyond the range of my flashlight. The tunnel was roughly 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, lined with the same type of concrete blocks used in the foundation. It wasn't a sewer line or utility tunnel, it was clearly designed for people to move through. The floor was worn smooth, like it had seen regular foot traffic over many years. I called the property management company immediately. The supervisor, a man named Dale Patterson, seemed genuinely surprised by my discovery. "A tunnel? That's not on any of the original plans we have," he said. "Are you sure it's not just an old utility access?" I sent him photos from my phone, and he agreed that it looked like something much more intentional than a utility tunnel. He told me to secure the opening and continue with the moisture assessment, but to document everything I found. That afternoon, I used my phone's flashlight and extended my inspection into the tunnel. It ran roughly 30 feet before branching in two directions, one branch heading toward the house next door, the other toward the backyard. The construction was professional quality, with proper drainage and ventilation shafts that were well concealed at ground level. But the most disturbing discovery was evidence that the tunnel was actively being used. There were fresh footprints and a thin layer of dust on the floor. Recently used electrical cables ran along the walls, providing lighting that could be controlled from multiple points. And there were small alcoves carved into the walls that contained supplies, flashlights, tools, and what looked like surveillance equipment. I was photographing these alcoves when I heard voices approaching from deeper in the tunnel system. Multiple people, talking in hushed tones, getting closer to my location. My heart started racing as I realized I was basically trapped in an underground passage with no easy way out except the way I'd come. I quickly retreated to the basement and called Dale Patterson again, but this time his response was very different. "Marcus, I think you need to stop what you're doing and come see me immediately," he said. "Don't discuss this with anyone else, and don't go back into that tunnel. This is more complicated than a simple foundation repair." When I met with Patterson that evening, he explained something that made my blood run cold. The tunnel system I discovered wasn't a secret. It was well known to longtime residents of Millbrook Creek. It had been built during the Cold War era, supposedly as fallout shelters connecting multiple houses in the neighborhood. But over the decades, it had been repurposed for something much more sinister. The old-timers used those tunnels to monitor newcomers, Patterson explained. They can access basements, observe what people are doing, even plant listening devices or cameras without ever being seen entering or leaving a property. It's how they've been driving outsiders away for years. Patterson showed me a map that detailed the full extent of the tunnel network. It connected nearly every house in a 6-block area, with multiple entry and exit points, storage areas, and observation posts. The system was maintained by a group of longtime residents who saw themselves as protecting the town's character and values. "The problem is, what they're doing is completely illegal," Patterson continued. "Breaking and entering, surveillance, harassment, it's a federal crime. But proving it and prosecuting it would destroy half the families in town. Everyone's either involved or too scared to speak up." He offered me a choice: finish the foundation work quickly and quietly, or get involved in something that could put me in serious danger. The tunnel system wasn't just about keeping outsiders away, it was about maintaining power and control, and the people running it had resources and connections that went well beyond Millbrook Creek. But I'm not the type of person who can walk away from something like this. I've built my reputation on honest work and doing the right thing, even when it's difficult. And what I discovered wasn't just illegal, it was a violation of everything I believe about people's right to safety and privacy in their own homes. Over the next week, I conducted what I called a comprehensive foundation assessment. That was really a detailed mapping of the tunnel system. Working with legitimate concerns about structural integrity, I was able to access multiple properties and document the full scope of what had been built beneath Millbrook Creek. What I found was even more extensive than Patterson had indicated. The tunnel system connected 18 houses, 3 businesses, and had access points near the school and town hall. There were electrical systems, communication lines, and storage areas that contained surveillance equipment worth tens of thousands of dollars. This wasn't amateur hour, this was a professional-grade operation that had been developed and maintained over decades. But the most disturbing discovery came when I was documenting the tunnel beneath a house on Maple Avenue. I found a room that served as a central monitoring station, with screens showing feeds from cameras placed throughout the town. I recognized several locations: the rental house where I'd first discovered the tunnels, the school parking lot, even the interior of some businesses. And there were files. Physical folders containing detailed information about every newcomer who'd moved to Millbrook Creek in the past 10 years. Photos, employment records, financial information, even personal correspondence that had clearly been obtained through surveillance or theft. I was photographing these files when I heard the sound of multiple people entering the tunnel system from different directions. They were coordinating through two-way radios, and it was clear they knew exactly where I was and were moving to surround me. I grabbed as many files as I could carry and headed for the nearest exit, but found my way blocked by 3 men in work clothes. One of them I recognized as Bill Henderson from the hardware store. Another was someone I'd seen around town but didn't know by name. The third was a younger man who looked like he might be law enforcement, even though he wasn't in uniform. "Mr. Rodriguez," Henderson said calmly, "you've seen some things that weren't meant for outsiders. We need to have a conversation about what happens next." They weren't threatening me directly, but the implication was clear. I was underground, outnumbered, and completely at their mercy. But I also had evidence of federal crimes in my hands, and they knew it. "This is what's going to happen," Henderson continued. "You're going to finish your foundation work, file your reports about moisture problems and structural issues, and then you're going to find other projects to work on. Somewhere else. The files you're holding are going to stay here, and you're going to forget what you've seen." The younger man stepped forward. And if you're thinking about involving outside authorities, you should know that we have friends throughout the county. Police, prosecutors, even some state officials. This situation has been stable for a long time, and we intend to keep it that way. But they made a crucial mistake. They assumed I was working alone, and they assumed I hadn't already documented what I'd found. What they didn't know was that I'd been uploading photos and videos to a secure cloud storage account throughout my investigation. Even if they stopped me, the evidence would still exist. I also had backup I hadn't told anyone about. My brother David is a federal building inspector, and I'd been consulting with him about some of the structural issues I was finding. When I didn't check in with him that evening as planned, he'd already started making calls to authorities outside the local area. The confrontation in the tunnel lasted about 20 minutes. Henderson and his associates made it clear that they could make my life very difficult if I didn't cooperate, but they also seemed to realize that simply threatening me wasn't going to solve their problem. Too many people already knew I was working in the area, and my sudden disappearance would raise questions they couldn't easily answer. Finally, we reached a compromise of sorts. I would be allowed to leave with my equipment and my documentation, but I would have exactly 48 hours to finish my work and leave town permanently. In exchange, they would begin dismantling the surveillance operation and sealing off the tunnel access points. But understand this, Henderson said as we prepared to leave the tunnels. If you involve federal authorities, if you go to the media, if you cause problems for this community, there will be consequences. We've been protecting this town for 40 years, and we know how to deal with people who threaten our way of life. I spent the next 2 days working faster than I ever had in my life. I completed legitimate foundation assessments for all the properties I'd been hired to inspect, but I also continued documenting the tunnel system and gathering evidence of the surveillance operation. Every photo, every video, every document was immediately uploaded to multiple secure locations. On my last day in Millbrook Creek, I had a conversation with a nervous young woman who was renting the house where I'd first discovered the tunnels. I couldn't tell her everything, but I could give her some advice. If you're having problems with privacy or security in this rental, you might want to consider finding somewhere else to live, I told her. And if you've noticed anything unusual, sounds, disturbances, items being moved, you should document everything and contact authorities outside the local area. She looked at me with an expression that told me my advice was both unnecessary and too late. She already knew something was wrong, and she'd already been trying to get help. Are you the contractor who's been working on the foundations? She asked. When I nodded, she continued, Other people have asked me about you. They wanted to know what you found, what you talked about. I think you should be careful. That afternoon, I loaded my equipment into my F-250 and left Millbrook Creek. But I didn't go home. Instead, I drove directly to the nearest FBI field office and spent the next 6 hours providing a detailed statement about what I'd discovered. The federal investigation that followed lasted 8 months and involved multiple agencies. The tunnel system was even more extensive than I documented, connecting to systems beneath the school, the town hall, and several businesses. The surveillance operation had been active for over 15 years and had been used to systematically drive away dozens of families and individuals who tried to establish lives in Millbrook Creek. 7 people were eventually arrested on federal charges including conspiracy, breaking and entering, surveillance violations, and civil rights crimes. Bill Henderson was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. The younger man who'd confronted me in the tunnels turned out to be a county deputy sheriff who was also charged with corruption and abuse of power. But the investigation also revealed something even more disturbing. The Millbrook Creek operation wasn't unique. Similar tunnel systems and surveillance networks had been discovered in 3 other small towns in the region, all connected to the same group of individuals who saw themselves as protectors of traditional rural values. The young teacher I'd heard about, Sarah Collins, had been right to fight back against the harassment she was experiencing. My discovery of the tunnel system provided the evidence that connected her case to a much larger criminal enterprise. But here's what still bothers me: how many other small towns have systems like this? How many people have been driven away from places they wanted to call home because of organized harassment they couldn't prove or fight against? As a contractor, I now look at foundation work differently. I pay attention to construction anomalies, unexplained spaces, and evidence of modifications that don't match original plans. And I always recommend that clients in small towns document anything unusual and maintain contacts with authorities outside their local area. Have you ever lived in a small town where you felt like you were being watched, or where longtime residents seemed to have an unusual amount of control over newcomers? What would you do if you discovered that your neighbors had been secretly accessing your home through hidden passages? My name is Jennifer Walsh, and I used to think I was losing my mind. For 6 months, I questioned my own sanity, my memory, even my basic perception of reality. What I discovered about my neighborhood in Millbrook Creek was so impossible, so disturbing, that even now I sometimes wonder if I dreamed the whole thing. But the evidence is real, the documentation is thorough, and what happened to me connects to something much larger than one woman's paranoid delusions. I'm 54 years old, a retired social worker who moved to Millbrook Creek in September 2022 after my husband passed away. I'd spent 30 years working in child protective services in Phoenix, dealing with the worst of human nature on a daily basis. I thought I'd seen everything, understood how people could manipulate systems and hide terrible secrets. But I was completely unprepared for what I found in this quiet mountain town. I bought a house on Willow Court, a pleasant street with mature trees and well-maintained homes. The real estate agent, a cheerful woman named Patricia Morris, had assured me it was a stable neighborhood with long-time residents who looked out for each other. She introduced me to several neighbors during the buying process: the Hendersons next door, the Mitchells across the street, the Johnsons 2 houses down. Everyone seemed friendly, welcoming, exactly what I was hoping for after decades of city living. But within weeks of moving in, I started noticing something that didn't make sense. The neighbors looked exactly the same as they had 30 years ago. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like the ravings of a woman who's been through too much stress and loss. But I have an excellent memory for faces. It was essential in my work, and I was absolutely certain I'd seen these same people before. It started with Bill Henderson from next door. When Patricia introduced us, I had the strongest feeling I'd met him before. Not just met him, but known him well. The feeling was so strong I actually asked if he'd ever lived in Phoenix or worked in social services. He laughed and said no, he'd been a lifelong resident of Millbrook Creek, never lived anywhere else. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling. I went through my old photo albums, looking for where I might have seen his face. And I found a photograph from a child welfare case I'd worked on in Phoenix in 1992. Bill Henderson was in the background of a family photograph, listed in the case notes as a family friend, who'd provided character references for the parents. The problem was, the Bill Henderson in that 30-year-old photograph looked exactly the same as the Bill Henderson I'd met that afternoon. Same face, same build, same mannerisms. He hadn't aged a day. I told myself it had to be a coincidence. Maybe it was his father, or an older brother. People can look remarkably similar within families. But the feeling nagged at me, especially when I started recognizing other neighbors. Carol Mitchell from across the street looked exactly like a woman I'd encountered during a case in 1995. The Johnsons matched a couple I'd interviewed in 1998 about their neighbor's suspected child abuse. One by one, I was recognizing people I'd met in professional contexts over the span of 3 decades. But none of them had aged appropriately. My rational mind tried to explain it away. False memories, stress-induced delusions, the psychological effects of grief and major life changes. I even made an appointment with my doctor to discuss whether my medications might be affecting my perception or memory. But the feeling persisted, and I started keeping detailed notes about what I was observing. That's when I noticed they were watching me too. It wasn't obvious at first. Just neighbors being neighborly, checking on the new person, making sure I was settling in well. Bill Henderson would find reasons to be in his yard whenever I was outside. Carol Mitchell always seemed to be looking out her window when I came and went. The Johnsons walked their dog past my house multiple times each day, always slowing down to peer at my windows. By November, I was documenting everything. I took photographs of my neighbors from my windows, noting the times and dates. I started a journal recording conversations, behaviors, anything that seemed unusual. And I began reaching out to former colleagues in Phoenix, asking them to help me verify some of the old case files I remembered. What they found confirmed my worst fears. My former supervisor, Maria Santos, still had access to archived case files. When I gave her the names and descriptions of my Millbrook Creek neighbors, she was able to confirm that people matching their exact descriptions had indeed been involved in multiple child welfare cases in Phoenix between 1990 and 2005. But the involvement was always peripheral family friends, character witnesses, concerned neighbors who'd called in reports. "Jennifer, this is really strange," Maria told me during a phone call in December. "These same names and descriptions appear in cases across different parts of the city, different time periods. It's like they were following families with children, always positioning themselves as helpful community members." The pattern was disturbing. In every case, these individuals had inserted themselves into situations involving vulnerable families. They'd gained trust, gathered information, and then disappeared when the cases were resolved or when families moved away. But now they were all living in the same small town, apparently unchanged by 30 years of time. I decided to test my theory. During a casual conversation with Carol Mitchell, I mentioned that she looked familiar, like someone I might have met in Phoenix years ago. Her reaction was immediate, and telling she became defensive, almost angry, insisting that she'd never been to Phoenix and had no idea what I was talking about. "You must be confusing me with someone else," she said sharply. "I've lived in Millbrook Creek my entire adult life. Maybe you should see a doctor about your memory problems." But later that day, I saw her talking intensely with Bill Henderson in his backyard. They were both looking toward my house, and their body language suggested they were concerned about something. That evening, I found a note slipped under my front door. "New places can be confusing. Sometimes our memories play tricks on us. It's better to focus on the present than to worry about the past." The note wasn't signed, but I recognized the handwriting from a Christmas card Carol Mitchell had given me the week before. By January 2023, I was certain I was living in the middle of some kind of long-term criminal operation. These weren't just people who looked like individuals from my old cases, they were the same people, somehow preserved across decades, continuing whatever they'd been doing in Phoenix but now concentrated in this isolated mountain town. I contacted a private investigator, the same Robert Chin who'd been helping other people with Millbrook Creek problems. When I explained my situation, he didn't immediately dismiss it as delusion. "I've had 3 other people contact me about Millbrook Creek in the past year," he said. "Different complaints, but all involving longtime residents who seem to have unusual influence and resources. What you're describing fits a pattern I've been trying to understand." Chen agreed to investigate my neighbors' backgrounds. Within 2 weeks, he'd uncovered information that validated my concerns and raised even more disturbing questions. The Bill Henderson living next to me had a social security number that was issued in 1987, but tax records showing employment in Millbrook Creek going back to 1975. Carol Mitchell had a driver's license issued in 1990, but property records showing she'd owned her house since 1982. The Johnsons had similar discrepancies, official documents that didn't match their claimed histories. More disturbing were the financial records. All of my neighbors had unusually complex financial arrangements, multiple LLCs, trust funds, and investment accounts that suggested far more wealth than their modest lifestyles indicated. And many of these financial entities had addresses in Phoenix, connecting them directly to the city where I'd encountered them decades earlier. "What I think you've discovered," Chen explained, "is a group of people who've been running long-term cons involving child welfare fraud, identity theft, and possibly human trafficking. They insert themselves into vulnerable families' lives, gather information and resources, then disappear and resurface elsewhere with new identities." But the most chilling discovery came when Chen traced the property ownership in my neighborhood. Nearly every house on Willow Court, and the surrounding streets was owned by the same network of shell companies. My neighbors weren't just living in the same area by coincidence, they controlled the entire neighborhood, deciding who could buy homes and who would be accepted as residents. You weren't supposed to be able to buy that house, Chen told me. Based on the ownership patterns, they control who gets to live there. The fact that you were able to purchase your property suggests either a mistake in their system or someone wanted you there for a specific reason. That realization terrified me more than anything else I'd discovered. If these people controlled the neighborhood, if they had decades of experience manipulating families and social services, then my presence there wasn't accidental. They had allowed me to move in, which meant they had plans for me. I started varying my routines, installing security cameras, and maintaining constant contact with Chen and my former colleagues in Phoenix. I also began reaching out to other recent arrivals in Millbrook Creek, trying to determine if anyone else had noticed the unusual behaviors I was documenting. That's when I learned about Sarah Collins, the teacher who'd been experiencing harassment and surveillance. When I contacted her through Chen, we compared our experiences and realized we'd been dealing with the same network of people. The individuals monitoring her were connected to my Unchanging Neighbors, and both situations were part of a larger operation that had been active in the town for years. But the breakthrough came when I was contacted by Marcus Rodriguez, the contractor who'd discovered the tunnel system. His documentation of the underground network provided the physical evidence that explained how my neighbors had been conducting surveillance and maintaining control over the neighborhood for so long. The tunnels connected directly to my house. There was an access point in my basement that I'd never noticed, hidden behind a false wall that looked like original construction. The people I'd been watching and documenting had been watching me just as closely, able to access my home whenever I was away. When federal investigators raided the properties in March 2023, they found evidence of a criminal enterprise that had been operating for over 30 years. The Unchanging Neighbors weren't the same people from my Phoenix cases, they were their children, trained from childhood to continue the family business of identity fraud and social services manipulation. But they had also undergone extensive plastic surgery to maintain the same appearances as their parents, allowing them to continue using established identities and relationships that had taken decades to develop. The Bill Henderson I'd been living next to was actually William Henderson Jr., surgically altered to look exactly like his father and trained to continue his father's criminal activities. The operation had been far more extensive than anyone realized. They'd been systematically infiltrating child welfare cases across multiple states, identifying vulnerable families, and either exploiting them financially or, in some cases, facilitating illegal adoptions and human trafficking. My house on Willow Court had been purchased by me because I was a former social worker with access to old case files. They'd manipulated the real estate transaction to get me into the neighborhood, planning to use my professional background and contacts to expand their operations or to eliminate evidence of their past crimes. The federal investigation ultimately led to arrests in 4 states and the rescue of 12 children who'd been placed in illegal adoptions. The tunnel system in Millbrook Creek was just one part of a network that included similar operations in small towns across the Southwest. But here's what still haunts me: how many other people have noticed that their neighbors seemed strangely familiar, strangely unchanged, and dismissed the feeling as paranoia or faulty memory? How many children have been lost to systems designed to exploit rather than protect them? I now work as a consultant for federal agencies investigating child welfare fraud. The experience in Millbrook Creek taught me that sometimes the most impossible-seeming observations are actually the most important clues. When something feels wrong, when people don't quite fit the stories they're telling about themselves, it's worth investigating further. Have you ever had the feeling that you'd met someone before, even when they insisted you hadn't? Have you noticed neighbors or community members who seem to have unusual influence, or resources that didn't match their apparent circumstances? In small communities especially, it's worth paying attention to those instincts. My name is Detective Michael Thompson, and after 26 years in law enforcement, I thought I understood the difference between suspicious behavior and genuine criminal activity. What I discovered about the Kellerman family on Hickory Lane in Millbrook Creek forced me to confront the possibility that sometimes the most obvious signs of danger are actually cries for help. This case taught me that appearances can be deceiving in ways I never imagined, and that the real monsters aren't always the ones who look frightening. I first encountered the Kellermans in February 2023, when I was assigned to investigate the interconnected criminal activities that had been uncovered in Millbrook Creek. The federal task force had identified multiple properties and individuals involved in surveillance, harassment, and fraud schemes, but there were still pieces of the puzzle that didn't fit. One of those pieces was the family living at 847 Hickory Lane. The Kellermans had been reported by multiple neighbors as suspicious and potentially dangerous. The complaints had been coming in for over 2 years, but local law enforcement had never found enough evidence to investigate thoroughly. With everything else we'd discovered about Millbrook Creek, the federal team wanted every unusual situation examined. According to neighbor reports, the Kellerman family consisted of a man, woman, and 3 children who kept entirely to themselves. They never spoke to neighbors, never participated in community activities, and rarely left their property except for what appeared to be supply runs to distant towns. The few times neighbors had attempted to make contact, they'd been ignored or met with hostile stares. But what made neighbors most uncomfortable was their appearance. David Kellerman was described as tall, gaunt, with long dark hair and facial scarring that suggested either an accident or violence. His wife Rebecca was equally thin, pale, and wore clothing that covered her completely even in warm weather. The children, 2 girls and a boy ranging in age from about 8 to 15, were described as looking feral and malnourished. They looked like something out of a horror movie. One neighbor, Patricia Williams, told me during my initial interviews. The kids never play outside, never laugh or make noise. When you do see them, they move like they're scared of their own shadows. Something terrible is happening in that house. Another neighbor, Robert Chen, not the private investigator, but a retired teacher with the same name, had been watching the family for months. I've never seen those children smile, not once. They walk with their heads down, never make eye contact. The parents watch the street constantly, like they're expecting trouble. It's not normal behavior. Based on these reports and the pattern of criminal activity we'd uncovered throughout Millbrook Creek, my initial assumption was that the Kellermans were either involved in the surveillance network or were potentially running their own illegal operation. The isolation, the suspicious behavior, the apparent control over their children, it all fit profiles I'd seen in cases involving abuse, trafficking, or organized crime. But when I conducted surveillance of the property, what I observed didn't match the criminal patterns I was expecting. The family's behavior was certainly unusual, but it seemed more defensive than aggressive. David Kellerman did watch the street frequently, but his body language suggested fear rather than hostility. Rebecca Kellerman tended a large garden behind the house with obvious skill and care. The children moved quietly, but when they thought they were unobserved, I saw them playing normal games and interacting like typical siblings. More importantly, I noticed they were being watched by others. During my 3rd day of surveillance, I observed individuals I recognized from the federal investigation conducting their own surveillance of the Kellerman property. Bill Henderson, before his arrest, had been parked across the street from their house for over an hour. Carol Mitchell had walked past their property multiple times, always slowing to peer at the windows. The same people who'd been harassing other newcomers were clearly focused on the Kellerman family. This changed my entire approach to the investigation. Rather than investigating the Kellermans as potential criminals, I began investigating them as potential victims. I ran comprehensive background checks on David and Rebecca Kellerman, and what I found explained everything. They weren't criminals, they were survivors. David Kellerman was a former federal witness who testified against a human trafficking ring in Nevada 8 years earlier. Rebecca had been a victim of that same trafficking operation who'd escaped and helped authorities build their case. The facial scarring that made David look threatening was the result of retaliation attacks he'd suffered before entering witness protection. Rebecca's behavior and appearance were consistent with long-term trauma recovery. The family had been relocated to Millbrook Creek through the Federal Witness Protection Program, given new identities and financial support to start over in a place that was supposed to be safe and isolated. But somehow, their location had been compromised. When I contacted the federal marshals responsible for witness protection in the region, I learned that the Kellerman family had been reporting suspicious activity around their home for over a year. They'd noticed being watched, followed, and photographed. Their children had been approached by strangers asking questions about their family. But local law enforcement had dismissed their concerns as paranoia. The Kellermans have been living in terror, Deputy Marshal Janet Foster told me. They knew their cover was blown, but they had nowhere else to go. The trafficking ring David testified against has connections throughout the Southwest. Millbrook Creek was supposed to be their safe haven. But instead of safety, they'd found themselves in the middle of another criminal operation. The same network that had been harassing newcomers and conducting surveillance throughout the town had identified the Kellermans as federal witnesses and had been monitoring them, gathering information, and potentially planning to sell their location to the trafficking organization they'd escaped from. The tunnel system Marcus Rodriguez had discovered connected directly to a monitoring station that had been focused specifically on the Kellerman property. Cameras, listening devices, and detailed logs of the family's activities had been maintained for over 18 months. The criminal network in Millbrook Creek had been systematically violating the witness protection program, putting this family at risk of retaliation or death. But the most disturbing discovery was how the community had been manipulated into participating in the surveillance. The neighbors who'd been calling in complaints about the Kellermans' suspicious behavior had been encouraged and coached by members of the criminal network. Patricia Williams, who described the family as looking like something out of a horror movie, had been receiving anonymous notes suggesting that the Kellermans were dangerous criminals who posed a threat to local children. Robert Chin, the retired teacher, had been approached by individuals claiming to be concerned parents who wanted him to keep watch on the suspicious family and report any unusual activities. He'd been unknowingly participating in organized harassment of a family that was already traumatized and vulnerable. "I feel terrible about this," Chin told me when I explained the situation. "I thought I was protecting the community. I had no idea I was helping to terrorize a family that had already been through hell." The manipulation had been systematic and sophisticated. The criminal network had used the Kellermans' unusual appearance and behavior, direct results of their trauma and fear, to turn the entire neighborhood against them. They'd isolated the family even further while gathering detailed intelligence about their routines and vulnerabilities. When I finally made contact with the Kellerman family, the interview was one of the most heartbreaking experiences of my career. David and Rebecca had been living in constant fear, knowing they were being watched but unable to get help from authorities who dismissed their concerns. They'd been trying to protect their children while having no idea who they could trust or where they could turn for help. "We knew something was wrong from the first month we were here," David told me. "People were watching us, following us, taking pictures. But when we reported it, the local police said we were being paranoid. They said new residents always feel like they're being watched until they settle in." Rebecca had been homeschooling their children because she noticed strangers near the school asking questions about new students. The family had been growing their own food because they'd discovered evidence that their mail and deliveries were being intercepted. Their isolation wasn't criminal behavior, it was a desperate attempt to protect themselves and their children. The children, when I was finally able to speak with them in a safe environment, were remarkably resilient despite everything they'd endured. The 8-year-old girl, Emma, drew pictures that clearly showed people watching their house from hiding places. The 12-year-old boy, Lucas, had been keeping a detailed journal of suspicious activities he'd observed around their property. The 15-year-old girl, Sarah, had been researching online how to detect surveillance equipment, and had actually identified several of the devices that had been planted around their home. "We learned to be quiet and careful," Sarah explained. "Mom and Dad taught us that there are bad people who might want to hurt our family, so we have to be smart and watch for danger. But we didn't know why all the neighbors were being mean to us too." The federal investigation revealed that the Kellerman family had been the primary target of the Millbrook Creek criminal network from the beginning. Their location as federal witnesses made them valuable to multiple criminal organizations, and the surveillance operation had been gathering information to sell to the highest bidder. But the family's resilience and survival instincts had actually helped them avoid the worst consequences. Their defensive behavior, their isolation, their careful observation of their surroundings, all the things that had made neighbors suspicious had actually protected them from being successfully targeted by the criminals who were watching them. The arrests that followed included not only the core members of the surveillance network but also individuals connected to the original trafficking ring the Kellermans had testified against. The investigation revealed that criminal organizations had been actively seeking federal witnesses throughout the region, using local criminal networks to identify and monitor protected families. The Kellerman family was relocated again, this time to a location with much better security protocols and community support systems. But their experience in Millbrook Creek highlighted serious flaws in witness protection procedures and community awareness programs. Patricia Williams and Robert Chen, along with several other neighbors, became advocates for better community education about how vulnerable families can be victimized by organized crime. They worked with federal authorities to develop programs that help communities distinguish between genuinely suspicious behavior and the defensive actions of trauma survivors. I learned that sometimes the people who look most dangerous are actually the most vulnerable, Williams told me months later. If I'd known what that family had been through, if I'd understood that their behavior was about survival rather than criminality, I would have been trying to help them instead of calling the police on them. The case changed how I approach unusual behavior in my investigations. Isolation, defensive postures, and apparent fear aren't always signs of criminal activity. They can be signs that someone is already being victimized and needs protection rather than suspicion. But it also reinforced the importance of thorough investigation rather than assumption. The Kellerman family's appearance and behavior fit stereotypes about dangerous or criminal families, but the reality was exactly the opposite. They were good people trying to protect their children in an impossible situation, surrounded by genuine criminals who were using community prejudices to further isolate and endanger them. Have you ever judged a family or neighbors based on their appearance or behavior without knowing their full story? How often do we assume that people who look different or act unusually are threats rather than potential victims who might need help? My name is Angela Foster, and I'm a K-9 handler with the County Sheriff's Department. I've worked with search and rescue dogs for 12 years, and I thought I understood how dogs think, how they track scents, and what drives them to dig and explore. But what happened with my neighbor's dog in Millbrook Creek last April changed everything I thought I knew about canine behavior and led to the final piece of evidence that brought down the criminal network that had been terrorizing our community. I'd moved to Millbrook Creek in January 2023, right around the time the federal investigation was ramping up. As a law enforcement officer, I was actually part of the task force investigating the surveillance and harassment complaints, though I was primarily there in a support capacity with my German Shepherd, Rex. We'd been assigned to help with evidence searches and tracking when needed. I rented a small house on Oak Street, and my next-door neighbor was an elderly man named Frank Sullivan who lived alone with his golden retriever mix, Buster. Frank was in his 70s, a retired postal worker who'd lived in Millbrook Creek for over 15 years. He seemed like exactly the kind of longtime resident the criminal network typically protected, so I was surprised when he approached me about problems he'd been having. "That dog of mine has been acting strange for months," Frank told me one afternoon while I was working with Rex in my backyard. "He keeps digging in the same spot, right along our property line. I fill in the hole, he digs it right back up. It's not normal behavior for him." Buster was about 8 years old, well-trained, and had never been a problem dog according to Frank. But over the past 6 months, he'd become obsessed with a particular area of Frank's backyard, near the fence we shared. Frank had tried everything: repellent sprays, physical barriers, even moving Buster's food and water to the other side of the yard to distract him. "I'm starting to wonder if there's something dead buried there," Frank said. "Maybe a previous owner buried a pet, and Buster can smell it even after all these years." As a K-9 handler, I knew that wasn't typical behavior. Dogs might be interested in old burial sites, but they don't usually become obsessively focused on them for months at a time. Buster's behavior sounded more like what I'd seen when dogs detected something that was actively generating scent, something recent, something significant. I offered to take a look at the area with Rex, thinking that a trained search dog might be able to identify what was causing Buster's fixation. Frank was grateful for the help, and we arranged to investigate the following weekend. When Rex and I examined the area where Buster had been digging, Rex immediately showed interest as well. But his body language wasn't consistent with detecting human remains or animal carcasses. Instead, his behavior suggested he was detecting multiple different scents layered in the same location, what we call a scent pool, that indicates repeated activity over time. I marked the area and decided to discuss it with Detective Thompson, who was leading the local aspect of the federal investigation. Given everything else we'd discovered about Millbrook Creek, any unusual activity warranted examination. But before I could arrange an official investigation, Buster solved the mystery himself. On a rainy Tuesday morning in April, I was awakened by frantic barking from Frank's yard. Looking out my window, I could see Buster digging furiously in his usual spot, but this time he was making real progress. The recent heavy rains had softened the ground, and he was excavating much deeper than he'd been able to before. I threw on clothes and went over to check on the situation. Frank was standing on his back porch in his bathrobe, looking frustrated and concerned. "He's been at it since 5 a.m., Frank said. "The rains got him all worked up, and now he's making a real mess of the yard." But as I got closer to where Buster was digging, I realized he'd uncovered something significant. About 3 feet down, partially exposed by his excavation, was what looked like a waterproof storage container. "Frank, you need to call this in," I told him immediately. "Don't let Buster dig any more, and don't touch whatever he's found. This could be evidence." Within an hour, Detective Thompson and a federal evidence team were at Frank's house. What Buster had discovered was the first of 7 waterproof containers buried in strategic locations around Millbrook Creek, each containing items that had been stolen from residents over the past 3 years. The container in Frank's yard held jewelry, electronics, important documents, and cash that had been taken from newcomers during the systematic harassment campaign. But it also contained something much more significant: detailed records of the surveillance operation, including photographs, personal information, and plans for escalating the harassment of specific individuals. "This is like finding a criminal's personal filing system," Thompson explained as the evidence team carefully excavated and cataloged the contents. "Everything we've been trying to prove about the organized nature of this operation is documented right here." But the discovery raised an obvious question. Why was this evidence buried in Frank's backyard? Frank had never been identified as part of the criminal network, and he never shown any suspicious behavior. If anything, he'd been trying to solve the mystery of his dog's strange behavior for months. The answer came when we examined the property lines more carefully. The container wasn't actually buried on Frank's property, it was buried on a narrow strip of land that belonged to the property behind his house, a house that had been vacant for over a year. From Frank's perspective, Buster had been digging in their yard, but technically the dog had been detecting evidence buried on the adjacent property. The vacant house belonged to Harold Mitchell, Carol Mitchell's deceased husband, whose property had been maintained by the criminal network even after his death. They'd been using the vacant lot as a storage site, burying evidence and stolen goods in locations they thought would never be discovered. But they hadn't counted on Buster's persistence and exceptional scenting ability. "Golden retrievers have some of the best noses in the dog world," I explained to Frank as we watched the evidence team work. "Buster wasn't just randomly digging, he was detecting something specific, something that had been generating scent for months. Your dog is actually a better detective than most humans." The search expanded to include the entire vacant property and several other locations where the criminal network had access. Using Rex and 2 other search dogs brought in from neighboring counties, we located 6 more buried containers over the next 3 days. The contents were staggering. Thousands of dollars in stolen cash and jewelry, identity documents belonging to dozens of people who'd left Millbrook Creek over the years, and detailed surveillance records dating back over a decade. But most importantly, we found evidence that connected the Millbrook Creek operation to similar criminal networks in other states. One container held correspondence with criminal organizations in Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico, detailing how the witness protection breach involving the Kellerman family was part of a larger operation to identify and track federal witnesses throughout the Southwest. Another contained financial records showing how stolen goods and information were being sold to organized crime groups across the region. Frank became something of a local hero when the story broke. His persistence in trying to understand his dog's behavior, and his willingness to involve law enforcement, had led to the discovery of evidence that might never have been found otherwise. "I knew Buster was trying to tell me something," Frank said during a news interview weeks later. "Dogs don't just act strange for no reason. When your pet's behavior changes dramatically, it's worth paying attention to what they're trying to communicate." But the discovery also revealed how the criminal network had been using vacant and abandoned properties throughout the region as storage and operational sites. The investigation expanded to include dozens of other properties, leading to the recovery of evidence in 4 states, and the identification of criminal operations that had been active for over 20 years. Buster's discovery was the final piece of evidence that connected all the separate investigations: Sarah Collins' harassment, Marcus Rodriguez's tunnel discovery, Jennifer Walsh's recognition of the unchanged neighbors, and the surveillance of the Kellerman family. Everything was part of a coordinated criminal enterprise that had been operating across multiple states and targeting vulnerable individuals and families. The federal prosecution that followed resulted in 43 arrests and the recovery of over $2 million in stolen property and illegal proceeds. But more importantly, it led to the rescue of dozens of people who'd been living under systematic harassment and surveillance, and the identification of criminal networks that were continuing to operate in other communities. Frank kept Buster, of course, though he joked that he'd never look at his dog's digging behavior the same way again. The area where the evidence was buried was properly excavated and restored, and Frank planted a small garden there as a memorial to all the people who'd been victimized by the criminal network. "Buster saved this whole community," Frank told me on the first anniversary of the discovery. "If he hadn't been so stubborn about that digging, who knows how long this would have continued." As a K9 handler, the case changed how I think about animal behavior and community awareness. Dogs often detect things that humans miss, not just physical evidence, but patterns of activity, unusual scents, and environmental changes that can indicate criminal activity. Buster wasn't trained for police work, but his natural instincts and persistence led to one of the most significant evidence discoveries in the entire investigation. But it also reinforced the importance of community members paying attention to unusual patterns and being willing to report them to authorities. Frank could have just kept filling in the holes and dismissing Buster's behavior as a nuisance. Instead, he recognized that something unusual was happening and asked for help. The criminal network in Millbrook Creek had been successful for so long partly because they'd convinced community members that unusual behavior should be ignored or handled privately rather than reported to outside authorities. Frank's willingness to involve law enforcement, even for something as simple as a dog's strange digging behavior, helped bring down an operation that had been victimizing people for decades. Have you ever noticed your pets acting strangely around certain areas or properties? Animals often detect things that humans miss: scents, sounds, or activities that indicate something unusual is happening. How often do we dismiss our pets' behavior instead of considering what they might be trying to tell us about their environment? Thanks so much for watching. I can't express enough how much your support means. The likes, the comments, it all really helps the channel grow. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. I always take the time to read them. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss out on any new videos. See you next time.